When I first started in Abbotsford School District, I inherited a 5 to 6 hour workshop or lesson. We do it in 2 parts. And it's the history of Aboriginal people. We call it First Nations government. When I start in the classroom, it's actually called Stalo government. So it's looking very specifically at the local First Nation. And it was first developed by Laura Smith, who was in the school district before she retired, soon after I started. But this is her lesson that she invented and crafted with the local First Nations, the Stalo First Nation community members. And it's quite, it's very interesting to go to from grade 4 to grade 12 to adults. But it's in the 6 hours. I'm just trying to think of the different things. The first thing we do is we find what defines government. What do you need in order to have a government? So we get them to make a definition. We need 8 things. We'll not go through those 8 things, but we get them to, okay, what do we need? And then we talk about Stalo, who are Stalo. And so many of the students are like, we don't know who Stalo people are. It's like, okay, well, it's Halkomelem. That's the language of the Stalo people. And we cover that. It's like, we're on Stalo territory, And so many of the children, I always have fun with that part because they're like, we're where? It's like, yeah, this is traditional Stalo territory. And so it's that's sort of the key point of it. It begins. The lesson kind of begins. The other thing is we clear all of the desks, so that kind of makes a real change within the classroom as well. Just changing their classroom. We cover the history of Aboriginal people. Lesson 1, who are the Stalo people? We then go over consensus as a decision-making process, which is a large piece of the part 1. So consensus is not voting. And many of the children are very challenged with this because it's all oral language. Nobody's writing anything down. No one's taking tallies. And it's a talking circle, and they all have to come to consensus. And it's a bit of a false, we make them decide on a CM, we make them decide on an elder, and I then assign children. So they decide who's who within their Stalo family. So it's a role drama. I have the children imagine that they are in a Stalo family 10,000 years ago. So that's our timeline. So it's a time-traveling workshop. So we start 10,000 years ago, and you add more information when there's adults, to sort of really conceptualize that this was a whole nation, Indigenous. This was a time when, there's only Indigenous people here, and it was a huge, complicated system, and there's high-end scientists, there's high-end, all of these craftspeople and society and complexities and richness of the local societies. And so I always take that, and that's sort of the range of that part of the lesson is, you go really simple, grade 4, all the way up to very complex ideas. The children, when they're making these decisions, it's really hard. It's really hard. And so at the same time, I'm adding elements of emotional education, trying to talk to them about how they're feeling. Okay, well, how do you feel about this? And so I bring out some anecdotes from Dr. Lee Brown, also Dr. Diane Millian around felt theory, and just sort of ask those questions. So, and that's kind of lays the stage for a little bit later of the workshop, because so you start at the beginning. So how do you feel about that? Are you mad? Are you angry? How do you think this should go? And so the consensus is really interesting. Because that's another part of the BC curriculum is the oral language part of it. And so if the students come from a classroom where they're all sitting in rows and nobody works in groups, then their consensus just easily falls apart. And we have tears, because if you aren't chosen to be the CM, which is a leader, or if you're not chosen to be the elder, yeah, there's going to be tears, right? But it's really interesting at the grade 4 or 5 level, because then it's asking the questions of, oh, well, this is how other people see me, right? So there's larger ideas happening for that student. So they then have once they've done that, and that takes a couple of hours, to do all of this. So I then assign, so they'll have CM elders, then I assign the children. So there's somebody, there's 4 groups, and each family has a role when we're done. Right after we have them in the groups, I then pull the CM, which are the leaders, and then get them to trade. So I bring it to November time, and I get them to trade with each other, and I talk about the trading system being the best of the best, that it's across the continent, through time, and it was the currency. And so they start to understand, how large and interrelated the continent is, right? So I always say at the beginning, when you decide on a main resource in your consensus, that you can't decide on buffalo because we're here in the Fraser Valley. But later in trading, I say, now you have access to that buffalo because you can trade for it. So they do that part of the trading. And then when the Siam are ready to return, I say, okay, we're going to move up to about 300 years ago. And this is a true story. Somebody's come to another territory to warn you of a disaster that's coming. And you have to prepare your families. And the children, they love it. They're like, yeah, okay, you get water. They return home, prepare their families. I only give them 30 seconds. It's 30 seconds of chaos. But then I line them up around the classroom according to their birth date. So if your birthday is in January, then you come line up. And we do it in silence, and I take it to about November. So most of 90% of the children are lined up. And that's when I talk about that there was a disaster. It was a huge, huge disaster for Indigenous people. And it's the smallpox. It's the viruses that came from that first contact. And that's considered first contact. And it'll be the first time that they have heard of that. I know we are very much about disasters in Hollywood. It's like, so Titanic. I was reading a newspaper. It's like, well, Titanic was such a huge disaster. It's like, oh, wait a second. We have something quite a bit larger. And it's the indigenous smallpox disaster. And so the children sort of unpack that a little bit. They're like, what? What happened? It's like, yeah, so this is, and I tell them at the intermediate level, don't worry, there's a happy ending. Indigenous people are here today, right? So don't worry, because at grade 4, when you're talking about death and disaster, I've had a few tears, right? So for the adults, I'm not quite as gentle with that fact. So I was like, well, you're an adult, you can handle it. The children, they kind of get an idea of that history, and it's like, okay, now think, and again, the question comes up, how do you feel about that? There's also, we'll think about who's left. I see there's a child here and a CM, but there's no elders. There's no elders left. How do we carry on? And then they start sort of thinking like that. And so by the first part of the workshop, they have that ownership of being a Stalo person, of playing that role, that empathizing. So they have a really strong connection now. It's like, we've kind of gone through the whole range of emotions for them, and now to end at a disaster. So they're emotionally invested in this story, this workshop, and that's where we end. I was like, okay, that's part 1. I was like, don't worry, there's a happy ending. We'll carry on to part 2. And then when we go into part 2, that's, I would say, we're going to come back to life, and, you're back into your families, and then we have them go over, just because usually some of the classrooms I go into, I'm not always able to be in there the very next day. So we just do some recap, put them back into their families, how far back in time did we go, who are the family members, what is your main resource, and then what was the disaster. And then part 2 begins. We talk about, the first one is the reserve law. So I make the children in their families, I then say, okay, we're saying you can't leave your territory. You have to stay here. You can't go out unless you have your paper. And so we have them do a sharing circle and talk about that and the implications for their family. And many of them really get it. So grade 4s and all the way up, they're like, well, this is going to cut us off from our land. We can't go trade with our neighbors because they're the canoe builders, and that's going to be a problem. Or that family over there, they're looking after the deer, and they have all of that resource, but we can't go get it when we want to. So they really understand the reserve law. I don't call it that reserve law. I just say you can't leave your territory. I also have a scan document from a museum in Alberta, where it's the actual paper to leave the reserve, and the children sort of hold it, and they're kind of like, what? This is real. And it's like, yeah, look at the date. It's 1892. You can't leave unless you have this paper. And so the children understand it. And they further, like some of the examples are, oh, well, what about, what if I want to go visit my family? It's like, no, you're not allowed. And they kind of really understand that the whole meaning of that law. And then soon after that law, we then cover residential schools, which means, and this is something I've preloaded them with information. Part 1, children play an important role next day. And so I've already said what the children do. They work hard for their family, they carry on the culture, and they make things fun. And so in part 2, I then take the children away, but I don't tell them why. I just say, okay, children, the next law says, and then I change my role before that. Sorry, I turned into the government agent. And I say, I'm not speaking Halkomelem anymore because I would use cues in Halkomelem in part 1. I no longer in part 2 because I become the government agent. And so government agent, the new law says you have to learn how to read and write English. And for the adults, I say, well, in real life, the communities were never asked this question, but I'm going to ask it. Who would be the best person to be the first person to learn how to read and write English? And the older students, as well, they understand. It's like, oh, well, maybe the elders should, because they're the traditional teacher. Or maybe the CM, the leader, because they now need to talk to the European communities. It's like, yeah, those are great ideas, but that's not what happened. This is what happens. And then I take their children and I line them all up. And then what I do for that part is just tell the facts. I don't tell stories until maybe the very end. But I just go through the list of facts for the residential schools, the Canadian dates, the BC dates, how many schools there are, the seasonal changes, the fact that they're getting haircuts, and that they're getting uniforms, and that they may or may not go home in the summertime or spring break or winter break, and all of those, just the facts. So I have a whole list of facts of this is what happens. And so the children are standing there and their hands are going up and they're asking lots of questions, wanting to ask questions. It's like, no, just wait till the end. It's like I have more facts. And so I find it really interesting after 10 years of teaching this lesson is some of the reactions are just so varied. And I remember because to teach this lesson for myself, I have to sort of be on guard. I have to put on the armor because this is our story. This is my mother's story, going to LeJac Residential School. So you sort of armor yourself. And I just remember there was a child sitting crisscross in his family, and I took all the children, I put them into residential school, and there was this little boy sitting on the ground, and he was just really emphatic. and caught me off guard because he turned and he goes, "But those are our children." I was like, "Yes." He goes, "But that's not democracy." And he got it. He's like, "Do you know what? You're right." And I just remember kind of choking for half a second and then carry on. But the children really understand it. They understand what's happening, and you just tell the facts. And that's sort of, wherever I go is when, because now it's coming to be in the new BC curriculum, it's like, that's all you have to do is just tell the facts, and the children really get it. I then get the children to ask lots of questions, and then I show some of the pictures. There's the girls. So Abbotsford School District, we have lots of children that are from the South Asian community. And so they have really long hair, especially the girls, they have really long hair. And so I've been in a classroom where all of them have super long braided hair. And I say, all of you are getting a haircut. And they're heartbroken. They're like, no, and they hold their hair. It's like, no, sorry, your hair's gone. It has to be cut off. Is it because it takes a lot of time and care to look after all long hair, and this school doesn't have that kind of time. And so once you sort of have to know all of the facts first, to help them in that process, to talk them through it, and to do it in a gentle way is another thing. Is one of the things that I've learned. It's like it's sort of like breaking bad news to somebody. It's like, oh, I'm sorry, but yeah, they're still going to have to cut your hair. Sorry. And they kind of, okay, and then they understand that we're all playing a role. I said, but it's a true story. So lots of different reactions. And it's something that I've been teaching for 10 years. And so I have some educators, co-educators, they're apprehensive. Oh, I don't know if I should. I don't know if I should teach this. It's like, if I come in, let me teach it, and then you'll see. It's like, it's contextualized, the whole lesson. It's not focused solely on residential school. It sort of lays the whole, 10,000, an abbreviated 10,000 years of history. So it's just one of many things that happen over a course of time. So I think that was one of the strengths, is it sort of gives a better, coming from a place of strength and wholeness, and this is what's happened over time, and what's happened in Canada with the Indian Act, and then residential schools, and then this is where we are now. Right. So, and I'm also apprehensive for the pictures that I show. It was really difficult to chase down, not so much now with the Truth and Reconciliation folks, but 5-7 years ago, it was difficult to chase down pictures that were in color, because I think that's one of the PR problems is in the classroom, is how it's seen. This just happened, right? So the pictures should be in color as well. So it took me a while to find some pictures that were in color for them to view when we look at them afterwards, and that really helped. Right after that, we send them back home, and then we get them to vote for a chief, which is sort of the undoing of the local leadership, traditional leadership. And so it's sort of, that's where I end it. I go, okay, it's 2014, and now we vote for chiefs. And in Abbotsford, we have 2 First Nations. So we have the Samath and Matsqui First Nation. And I always ask them, do you know we have two First Nations? And they're very often, no. It's like, okay, well, we have 2 chiefs in Abbotsford. Did you know that? And they're like, no. It's like, okay, well, we have Chief Dalton Silver, Chief Alice McKay in Abbotsford today. And they're sort of, wow, really? It's like, yeah. And that's where I kind of leave it. And that's that in a larger nutshell of what the workshop is. Yeah. So it's sort of a whole range of elements from the government in relationship with Indigenous people. Yeah. There's so much more, I think, at the high school level and at the university level, adult level, is that 10,000, that pre-contact era is something that I try to add more strength to, because, and even for myself, is to contextualize, the strength of our people was huge, and the complexities of our societies were so advanced, that we have to try to have that in mind, and that's where I get a lot of, we have to have that. I'm a big fan of strength, and that's where sort of the time when I look at, when we think of decolonization, I always think of that pre-contact time when we were whole societies. Yes, I'm sure we were warring with each other, neighbors and all, but sort of the understanding of our land, our connections to each other and to the land, and that time of strength. Because I think there's so much within education as well, but in many of the different areas, health, in social services, there's always that deficit thinking. There's always that, oh, they're Indigenous. Oh, okay. It's like, no. It's not like that. And if I don't have a sense of where that strength is coming, then I kind of feel like, well, I'm not promoting, that we're very fabulous, strong, resilient people. Yeah. Teaching residential schools in all schools in all settings is very important, and to just start, you just start with the information, and I always look to another Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust, and very often they start with stories. Right? They start with stories, and there's so many different ways of teaching this genocide in the classroom. And yes, it's a really tough topic. And now that we're hearing more stories from the Truth and Reconciliation folks, it's getting tougher. Some of the stories that the residential schools, that there were electric chairs, this sort of things going on, happening in the residential schools. The stories are still coming out. I mean, we're still kind of in the middle of it. But just to jump in and start with stories is a good start. You can certainly start, there's curriculum being crafted with the First Nations Education Steering Committee. I know they have a grade 4, grade 5 curriculum and a high school curriculum. It would be to put on your armor, put on your chainmail the best you can. Because you have to, once you learn the stories, once you hear or read or experience it yourself, read some of the stories, read some of the books. There's many books coming about residential school experiences, and to mourn, to learn that for yourself. Have your own understanding, but your own emotional understanding. Because when you go into the classroom, you need to be ready. You can't teach this lesson and cry for the whole half an hour, which is very reasonable. When I was first being trained, that was the first thing, was to cry the tears, have them out, because when you teach it, you need to just hold your ground. And I always think of there's a great scene. I'm a big movie viewer, I guess, but there's a scene in X-Men where Wolverine is just, he's trying to move towards somebody, and he's just being like, torn apart with, looks like white heat. And it's like, that's kind of where you got to go. You got to be ready. When you're teaching this, it's painful. Painful. I mean, it really is a Holocaust. And how do you teach that? It's like, well, you find the facts, yes, but you yourself have to be ready. You have to be able to stand your ground and tell the truth and not fall apart in multiple tears. Yeah. And it's hard. It's really hard.